I'm going to be real with you here for a quick second. The reason that this video has taken as long as it has is because I really did not want to play Devil May Cry 2. This is just one of those games that manages to suck out any of the life that I have in my already decaying body. But if you're watching this video, it means I survived. Unfortunately, it means that you have to endure this with me as well. So let's just get into it. Devil May Cry 2 is a game that everyone knows about by now. It's easily the worst game out of all the DMC titles, and almost all of the personality, depth in its gameplay, and intrigue from the first game's storyline has been tossed out the window in favor of something that frankly feels soulless. It's one of those experiences that just feels hollow in every sense of the word. I'd go so far as to say that Devil May Cry 2 is the biggest step down that any sequel for a game has ever had. I mean, honestly, the recipe for success was right there with the first game. Devil May Cry was such a cool and unique experience, so much so that you'd think a sequel would elevate everything to the next level. Instead, we got a game that manages to commit the worst sin that any game could ever make, and that's being a 5 out of 10. But why did Devil May Cry 2 end up the way it is? Well, that's actually a pretty tough question. To sum it up simply, development for Devil May Cry 2 was a hectic nightmare and did not go in the direction that it probably should have. For example, Dante's personality was changed to be much more serious because a producer didn't like that he cracked jokes in the first game. Then there's the fact that the team simply didn't know what they were doing, as too few had any experience with 3D action games. Devil May Cry 2's first director, Noritaka Funamiya, would then essentially be replaced with Hideaki Itsuno, and it was Itsuno's job to try and turn the ship around and get some kind of product out there. This essentially makes Devil May Cry 2 a hodgepodge of different unfinished ideas that never really coalesced into any coherent concept. And that's not even mentioning how stressful the development process was for the team itself, who had to get the game finished in just 6 months. DMC2 also had plenty of ambitious concepts planned, like difficulty scaling, open-ended missions, and fully customizable controls, which was all intended to make the game easier for players without any action game practice. Devil May Cry 2 is a game that had the best of intentions, but unfortunately it was never able to make any of those a reality. And so we've got a game that is, frankly, shit. Honestly, where do you even begin with this game? I guess we'll start off by talking about the story, and don't worry, there is not much to say. Devil May Cry 2 is set roughly 10 years after the events of Devil May Cry, and opens on a similar note. Though, instead of discussing Sparda alone, the opening voice also alludes to Dante in this mysterious way, perhaps indicating his own renown in the world after years of hunting demons. The first character we see is Lucia, who is in a museum for reasons, when she is suddenly attacked by demons. But don't worry, because Dante is here to swoop in and take the glory. He's here because Lucia has asked him for help, I think, but she doesn't really tell him anything and throws a knife onto a map, which I guess tells Dante where to go? Anyway, that's the opening, that's it. All of the energy and excitement from the first game's opening is gone. It's nowhere to be seen here. And it does a really bad job at sucking you into any kind of plotline. And I'm telling you, you better strap in, because this is the exact same vibe that the entire game gives off. The very next scene is just Dante standing on top of a massive church where I guess he sees where he's meant to go, like this is Assassin's Creed. A random house in a village in the countryside is his objective. You only get an idea of what's actually going on when you get to the end of the first mission, where Lucia's grandmother explains that Sparda once fought with her people in Ville de Marly, the name of the island we're on, against some demons. And she asks Dante to kill someone named Arius, who has turned the island into a demon's paradise. Arius is actually a big-time rich CEO, and it's Dante's job to destroy capitalism. It's here you'll notice that Dante's got a new shtick, a gimmick if you will. A coin that he flips to help decide whether he'll take a job on. And I actually don't mind this. Dante's always been this kind of showboat anyway, and adding this little bit of theatricality doesn't actually bother me all that much. It's also a double-sided coin, or I guess a double-treshed coin, so it's entirely for theatrics. The problem here is that Dante is just so incredibly boring. He doesn't have a single ounce of charm or charisma here that he had before in the previous game, and it makes his appearance seem very jarring. Sure, he's got a good line here and there, but even these are delivered with the pizzazz of an unmilked bowl of oats. Lucia's even worse, because her only real characteristic is that she's got red hair. Genuinely, I cannot think of a single word that I would use to describe her, apart from cardboard. There is a reason that she has never made an appearance in any of the games since 2, and has been relegated to stories outside of the games. There's just nothing going on with her, and yay, because she has her own goddamn campaign that we have to play through. And I'm gonna say this right now, simplistic stories, they're fine. Devil May Cry 1 was just about Dante going off and getting revenge for his mother and brother that got killed by some demon. But there's still something cathartic about that. Going out and killing some random CEO because he's into buying black candles at the Halloween store isn't exactly an exciting motive. And sure, I guess it's cool to meet someone who knew Sparta, but it's only talked about in this one scene, and we never find out anything more. So we may as well just disregard all of this. The first few areas in DMC2 are bland, but fit well with the Devil May Cry aesthetic that we've had up until now. The architecture here all looks incredibly old and hints at there being a larger story in this town. But the next part of the game decides to take a 180, and we're brought to a full-blown city. On one hand, it's pretty cool to see Dante do his thing in an area like this, and on the other hand, it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the locations in the series. It also lacks any real personality. It's literally just a city. Anyway, Dante fights through several enemies, including a demon tank and helicopter at one point, and some other stuff, and eventually finds Arius, who has Lucia as a hostage. Dante seemingly gives Arius a coin, which he needs to open up a portal to the demon world and summon Argosax, which he thinks will give him immortality if he absorbs it. Dante manages to get Lucia back, and the two escape the tower, but need to find a way back up. So cue a bunch of filler missions until Dante gets back, and it's revealed that the coin Dante gave Arius was actually his double-trished one, as opposed to the one needed for the ritual. Dante then beats Arius up, and all's well that ends well. Except a portal to the demon world is opened anyway, and someone has to go in there and kill Argosax once and for all. Dante tricks Lucia into staying behind with his coin and goes down to finish the job. He does his thing and rides a bike off into hell, never to be seen again, in the game at least. Dante's storyline really is that simple, and if I've left anything out, it's because it's not important to the actual plotline. That is literally it. In comparison, Lucia's story is actually a bit more interesting. She's revealed to be an artificial being created by Arius, and her story is about hunting him down for some good old revenge. Obviously, she fails, but learns some pretty important lessons about how family is stronger than simple blood ties, and it's who you're with in the here and now that counts. Of course, this lesson is pretty redundant when Lucia asks Dante to kill her 10 minutes later, so she doesn't maybe go on a rampage. Lucia's final encounter is against Arius, who has actual powers this time, but since this is DMC2, it's not a big deal. Lucia is then left wondering where Dante is, and she goes back to his store from DMC1 to wait for him, when we suddenly hear the noise of a bike outside. And that's it, that's the story of DMC2. I wouldn't even say it's a simple story, because when you really break it down, there is a lot going on. It's just that none of it is interesting. But now that the story is done, we can get to the real meat of Devil May Cry 2. And it's rotten to the core. The gameplay on offer here is largely the same as the first game on the surface. You've got sword strikes, guns, and jumping as your 3 core abilities in combat. There's also a dodge button that gives Dante a full-on dodge roll, which turns into a wall run if you press the button next to a wall. Dante also starts off this game with a double jump and stinger from DMC1, so it's nice in that it doesn't feel like we're starting from square one for some arbitrary reason. On the surface, I actually like a lot of the gameplay changes in Devil May Cry 2. For one thing, Dante is really maneuverable, and his dodge roll gives him a really quick way to close in on enemies. The problem is that this game never really uses his maneuverability in any meaningful way. All the enemies are slow and dull and don't require Dante to do anything other than swing his sword and win. This game also illustrates just how careful the balance was in DMC1 with giving Dante a certain level of speed. By making Dante's base movement speed in DMC1 a bit sluggish, you had to make real choices about using moves like Stinger, which would create a large gap between you and an enemy. It also meant that using the speed boost with his Devil Trigger felt like you were popping something quick and powerful. In comparison, Devil May Cry 2's combat just asks you to think about so much less. There's no nuance in Dante's gameplay here, or Lucia's for that matter. And while wall running is pretty cool, there's no real use for it. It doesn't work half the time anyway. Attacking enemies with Dante's sword is also a really limp experience too. There's no solid feedback to the swings, no satisfying impact when he lands any of his hits. Almost all the weight from DMC1 has just been removed. The way you do different sword combos is also completely different to the first game. Before, you would delay your input a tiny bit before pressing the button again. But here, it's all dependent on when you actually push the stick during a combo. It gives you about 5 different combo variations, it just depends when you tilt the stick during a combo. And this is an extremely clumsy system, since it means you basically can't lock on half the time if you want to use some combo variations to spice things up. Because remember, Stinger and High Time are still dependent on you pushing the stick forward and back while attacking and locking on. Most of these extra combos are also pretty useless, except for the one that just has Dante slashing ahead of him a bunch of times, since that tends to do a lot of damage. But anyone who's played DMC2 knows that this is all bullshit. You never need to swing your sword in this game because of the guns. For some reason, the guns in DMC2 do so much damage in comparison to every other entry in the series, to the point where using them to deal the majority of damage to a boss is almost always the best tactic. And this is doubly the case if you go into Devil Trigger, because the ranged attack in Devil Trigger can rinse any enemy in about 10 seconds. It just makes every encounter in the game the same boring mess of building up the Devil Trigger meter and holding down square for about 10 seconds and winning the game. And some bosses make it so difficult to actually attack them with melee that it's almost unbearable to play the game any other way. Look, I get that the developers of Devil May Cry 2 wanted the game to be more accessible for those that couldn't really play Devil May Cry 1. But that doesn't mean you make the game the same boring mess of half-assed combat mechanics and enemy types that don't do anything except stand there. I mentioned earlier that Dante begins DMC2 with Air Hike and Stinger, which are normally abilities that you have to unlock in the DMC games. And the reason that you start off with them in DMC2 is because there are no abilities to unlock. You instead just spend red orbs on making the weapons do more damage. And even then, it's not a noticeable upgrade. This ends up making the game even blander than it could be, since you don't have any cool unlockables to look forward to. You also may have noticed these icons next to the health bar, and this is Dante's talisman. Throughout the game you can find add-ons to the talisman that change certain aspects of the Devil Trigger. One lets Dante fly, another lets him run quickly, and others change the element of his attacks from electricity to fire or ice. It's a cool system honestly, but one that does not matter all that much in the grand scheme. You're never going to be at a point in the game where you fiddle with any of this stuff. You'll see you've got a new one, go ooh, and stick it in and forget what's going on. Devil May Cry 2's soundtrack is also fine. I'm a sucker for early 2000s techno, and this game does have that, along with the classic DMC guitar sound, but no track has ever stuck with me, and that's a shame. It also comes off as a tad generic for the most part, and that's something you definitely can't say for any other title in the series. But is there anything of value in this game at all besides a few promising but undeveloped gameplay ideas? Well, for one thing, I'd say that DMC2 has Dante's best design. There's something so simple about his outfit in this game, and it's a crime that it's not featured as an unlockable in any other titles. But that's about all the good things I have to say about this game from a visual standpoint. If we had to talk about all of the other character designs, I'd say they're fine. Lucia looks pretty cool and meshes well with Dante, but Arius looks goofy and generic. Enemy designs aren't anything to write home about either, since they're all sort of bland. Don't get me wrong, DMC1 wasn't amazing with its enemy designs either, but they had a little more personality than what we've got here. Some of the bosses are also so incredibly ugly, and I don't have a grander point here, they're just kind of gross. As far as the visuals for the levels go, I flip between liking them and also cursing the hands that created them. Broadly speaking, I'd say that DMC2 doesn't look bad necessarily, it's just sort of bland. Some stages, like the city streets, actually do a decent job at conveying the right vibe. But then we have some rooms like this that are just so painful to look at. DMC2 also lacks any of the detail and personality that Malay Island had in DMC1. That game had plenty of things to interact with, and each of its rooms was packed with tons of detail. And here, we're left with barren corridors that don't really make me feel anything. Devil May Cry 2 is really just a terrible game from start to finish. It has lots of ideas that on paper seem pretty good, and I like the fact that the team tried to make something a bit more accessible for those who aren't amazing at action games. But the unfortunate truth is that Devil May Cry 2 just does nothing to warrant any sort of praise. It's a blemish on a series that really does not have a bad entry apart from this one. It's really hard for me to imagine how Capcom could have fumbled the sequel to such a surprise hit. But a quick peek into its development history tells you all you need to know. The dev team simply didn't know what they were doing, and in just 6 months' time, they had to scramble together what they had and make something that resembled an actual video game. I don't envy the task, and I imagine that it must have been hell for everyone involved. Thankfully, this isn't where the tale of Devil May Cry ends. In fact, just after the game was released, Itsuno proposed another game to Capcom, another chance to prove that both he and the team could make a true sequel to Devil May Cry 1. And as far as redemption arcs go, the next game in the series is one hell of a way to bounce back.